friends. Uncle Marv here with another episode of the Unhealthy Podcast, the show where we explore health and wellness much beyond diet and fitness. So originally we talked about transforming our unhealthy habits and lifestyles into healthier ones, but we are bridging out and talking about a lot of stuff when it comes to unhealthy relationships, unhealthy habits with money, unhealthy mindsets. And so, folks, that's what we're going to be doing. And today I have a new friend, and I'm going to go ahead and give a quick disclaimer here. This is a topic that I know absolutely nothing about, and I have no business trying to pretend like I know anything about it. So part of this conversation is going to be me asking a lot of dumb questions to get an understanding of something called microdosing. And I have Julie Hagen that is going to chat with us about that. And she's got a great story. I hope you enjoy it. Julie, welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on. I really appreciate it. And I love that, you expressed that this isn't something that you've ever done. It's really not in your realm of any sort of habit, but you're very willing and open to having a conversation around it. And I think the world could just use more of that willingness to have conversations that maybe aren't necessarily in our normal vein of interests or things we even ever anticipate doing, just to learn and view new perspectives.
Right. Well, listen, a lot about life is learning to accept what else is going on that may not necessarily be what you're accustomed to, what you grew up learning about. There are many ways of doing things. So when it comes to things like our health, when it comes to little things like the sports we like, the foods we like, we're not all the same. We, have differences in our lives, our bodies, and how we experience things. And I think the world is just now beginning to understand that we've got to let everybody kind of be who they are. And everybody experiences things differently. And even when it comes to something like microdosing, which again, when I heard that term, I'm like, I don't know what that means. And then I heard mushrooms being associated with, and I was like, I really don't know what that means. And part of me was like, I don't want to know what that means, because the association from my mind was that sounds all druggish and not something that I want to do. And part of that is because I grew up as an athlete, and it was something where I didn't want my body to be impaired or altered in any way. I did not drink, when I was playing sports. Well, let me rephrase it. I drank once, and my coach really got on me for that. But even, smoking, drinking, anything was stuff where I wanted to always be in control of my body and my mind. And I thought, that's what I got to do it. But I know that there are a lot of things mentally where we need drugs to kind of help cope. And we have mental illness. We have things of that nature that, listen, drugs are a part of life. So I'm opening myself up, and I hope you'll help me and my listeners understand the right things that we need to know.
I'm super excited for this conversation and just really appreciate, again, your willingness to have a conversation and have me on.
All right. So let's first understand what we're talking about. I want to get into your story a little bit later, but I first want to go back and let's just understand, I guess you would probably term it as microdosing 101. And for somebody who knows absolutely nothing, let's start with, what is it?
So one thing about microdosing is I believe people often hear about it and come to it with a certain perception in their mind of like what you're microdosing, but the general term microdosing can apply to so many things. You can microdose psilocybin, which is what I work with, aka, magic mushrooms. You can microdose cannabis, which oftentimes is really effective for helping people with pain. You can microdose LSD, another psychedelic. So microdosing simply refers to the practice of taking a small amount, a sub-perceptual amount, something that's a 10th, a 20th of what would be considered a normal dose or a dose required to have like the traditional experience of whatever it is you're microdosing. Doing that with the intention of receiving some of the same benefits without being cognitively impaired by whatever it is that you're taking, or to what you were speaking to before, feeling like you are no longer in control. That is not the experience of microdosing. You are very much in control. And regardless of what you are microdosing, it should be so perceptual that it, is less than having a glass of wine. It's less than smoking a joint. It's less than taking a Benadryl, even in terms of what it does to you cognitively.
Okay.
Perception.
So we need to understand that this is not the same thing we see people doing recreationally, where they just may say, hey, I need a hit to get through the day. That's not what we're talking about, right?
Well, I will say there's definitely people who microdose in a more recreational fashion. Like maybe they want to have life feel a little bit sparklier, but not have a full psychedelic experience, and they want to, go to a concert or something. That I would still say is a recreational experience. The way that I talk about and facilitate microdosing is a very intentional process to achieve a certain intention or goal. And usually that is mental health related. But it is always much less impaired than a full experience of anything else.
Okay. So let's go back and ask at least one setup question in terms of when did you first do a microdose?
That's a great question. That story is really interesting. I wasn't really looking for microdosing. I feel microdosing found me. I have a different history than you when it comes to different substances. And I was open to the idea of psychedelics because I had used them before at fuller doses, always more intentionally because I was very scared of psychedelics. I grew up feeling really impacted by the government propaganda, dare, don't say no to drugs, all of these things, not really understanding the history of psychedelics, especially, other than cocaine, heroin, yes, but psychedelics have a much different history and a much different use and potential uses therapeutically than other substances. And so I was cautious of them. But when a friend about 4 years ago said, hey, Julie, I'm investing in this company. It's going to start producing microdoses of psilocybin. I would love for you to come see the facility as well as try the product. I was very intrigued because this was a friend. I ran a nonprofit at the time. He was a partner that we worked with in Colombia. He's an expat. He's from Southern California. And so I really trusted this person. I respected him. He's one of the most genuinely outwardly focused people I know, really cares about contributing to the world. And so I was very intrigued by him saying this to me. And, I went with him to where the company was based and had their facilities. And he gave me a little tin of 20 microdoses of psilocybin and was like, see what you think. And I'm very much someone who's always been interested in science and why things work. And I was a little confused about what's happening with a microdose. I understand, when you are having a larger psychedelic experience, some of the things, at least from what I had personally experienced, were happening, but I wanted to know more. I wanted to learn. And so I picked up Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind, which I think is an amazing place for anyone to start who's interested in this. I think Michael Pollan is an amazing author. He's had a lot of great books that he really explains things in a tangible way. And he comes from a very science-focused perspective. He's not some woo guru in the desert with a hat and a long, shawl on. He is just a regular dude who writes about these concepts. And so reading that book really intrigued me and led me to doing my own research, reading research papers, taking different courses from different places simply to understand what was happening. And then based on my research, I combined microdosing with tools that I had in my toolbox from being a certified coach and breathwork facilitator and learning more about psychedelic facilitation. And I microdosed in a very intentional, purposeful way in order to achieve a goal or an aim. And it was interesting. People really responded to me sharing about my microdosing journey online because that is how I have always built my online coaching business, through sharing my experience. And as a result of all of that interest, I became a microdosing mentor and helping other people get the most out of their microdosing experiences.
Okay. A lot of questions there I have now. But let's go back to understanding the difference, because you talked about microdosing, and then you mentioned even early in that last description, a full dose. So what's the difference between a full dose and a microdose? And I'm assuming it does differ depending on what substance you're talking about, right?
Certainly, like the exact gram amount or micrograms definitely matters when we're speaking about different substances, right? Like you would never, well, I can't imagine, for instance, taking 2 grams of LSD, but LSD is measured in micrograms. And when you think about a full dose, I think about full surrender or lack of ability to discern what is really happening in reality, to be capable of, for instance, driving a car, operating heavy machinery, things like that. That's not possible safely. I would never do it or recommend it on a full dose of anything, right? You're very much cognitively distorted versus a microdose where it's not perceptual in, I'm not going to see a caterpillar come out of the wall. I'm not going to see the walls breathe, as people sometimes stereotypically say about psychedelic experiences. I'm going to go about my life and perceive things in the way that I usually do, or at least perceive them through the lens of, normal reality. But my inner workings, my stories, my perceptions and lenses mentally are going to be shifted to allow me to move through life a little bit easier, to feel less of that anxiety, depression, OCD, addiction, PTSD, and to kind of come back to myself, to feel less burdened mentally in how I go about life.
All right. So you mentioned a whole bunch of things that I was going to ask in terms of who would this be for? And you mentioned a lot of the things, even PTSD. How does somebody know that microdosing is something that they should consider?
Well, what I really love about microdosing is there is a whole range of benefits, and some of them are extremely unexpected. That's one of my favorite questions to ask people as we come to the end of our time working together. What is the most unexpected benefit that you gain from this process? So I've had people tell me that their sleep is much more consistent. If they have the Oura ring or whatever, they can tell their REM is better. They're getting more restful sleep. I've heard people say it allowed me to do things that felt really hard before, like taking care of my house, washing the dishes. It just becomes easier to sort of do these things that felt like they took such a great expenditure of energy. But traditionally, I think where people are really drawn to this work is when they do experience one of 5 mental health issues that are very closely related in functionality and kind of how they work, which are those of anxiety, depression, PTSD, OCD, and addiction. So those are where most of the research is in microdosing and psychedelics in general. But I do think it's a beautiful practice for a lot of people if they would like to work to sort of enhance their progress toward a goal.
All right. So you partially answered the next question, because I was going to ask, some of the stuff you were describing sounds like somebody that would have the inability to focus with, ADHD, that sort of a thing. And then you mentioned depression. Those to me seem like opposites.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. So I would say like the 5 that I mentioned, we'll call them, I guess, the rigid 5, because a lot of they deal with at their core a rigidity in our brain and the way we're thinking and our behaviors. Those are definitely interrelated. And there is so much research out there coming out now about using microdosing to support people who have attention disorders like ADHD, ADD. So what's interesting about that is we can see that even though these 2 things do seem different and perhaps unrelated, there's so much to be said about the world of, psilocybin in particular and what it can do for us, because in a big self-reported study of people who were prescribed attention deficit pharmaceuticals, so Vyvanse, Adderall, an overwhelming majority said that they liked the benefits of microdosing more than they enjoyed the experience or benefits from things like Vyvanse or Adderall, oftentimes because Vyvanse or Adderall can kind of make you feel edgy. It can make you feel a little bit more anxious. And, this chemical structure is very close to drugs that we would never think of taking in any sort of like positive sense, right? Like it is an amphetamine. So there's a lot that microdosing can do for you.
Okay. Now, of course, I'm going back into my preconceived notions that microdosing can be misunderstood as, going through a full experience of, having a trip or stuff like that. But when you and I first met and we were kind of talking about this, there is a scientific perspective on this. And this isn't something that you learn just by simply doing it, right? There's some training that goes into this and some strict guidelines, I guess, as to how microdosing is supposed to be applied, right?
Certainly when you're doing it from the way that I like to facilitate, which is very intentional, it's focused around your intention or your goal in coming to this work. And there's even some debate in the field. So for instance, Dr. James Fadiman is the person who created this idea of microdosing. And when it comes to psilocybin, he would say that a microdose is anywhere from 0.1 grams to 0.5 grams. However, in the way that I facilitate, I disagree with Dr. Fadiman. I actually facilitate from 0.1 to 0.2 simply because that is where I feel most of my people that I work with can keep it truly sub-perceptual. And I know, at least for myself, at 0.5 grams, I'm definitely I'm feeling that something is sort of happening and I don't like that. It makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. It makes me feel a bit like I can't actually go about my normal life. And it begins to feel like something, which isn't the goal. So oftentimes people think like, oh, microdosing isn't working because I'm not feeling anything. I would actually challenge that person and say that you're probably at a true microdose. You're still receiving positive benefits in your brain without needing to feel off or altered or different.
So it sounds like the best way that people can experience this is to have clarity as opposed to feeling something altered.
Yes. Yeah, definitely. Clarity is a huge benefit. I would say ease is a huge benefit of just feeling like you can do things without so much, whether that be internal struggle or lack of energy. Focus is a large benefit, and feeling less burdened by mental stories, by mental strife.
All right. Now, people that are looking at this from another perspective might want to ask the question, okay, there's got to still be some risk, right? So are there, even at such a minor dosage level, is there still a risk or, side effects, complications, that sort of thing?
So I will say, when I talk about like functionality of microdosing, what's physiologically happening in our brain, sort of the biggest layer to talk about is simply entropy or chaos, and it does increase entropy. And because entropy is chaos, oftentimes people have this feeling of, oh, I don't want that. And certainly for people who have or have a family history of schizophrenia or psychosis, that is not desirable because there's already too much entropy in their brains, and that's what's causing these conditions. So yes, I would never facilitate even microdosing for someone who is has a family history of that or who experiences it themselves. And that's part of the reason why, I don't believe this work is something where you can just like click on a link and go do it and on your own and be fine. I really believe in every person I work with. We go over these things. We have conversations. We talk about what medications they may be currently on because there certainly are contraindications. So for instance, we hear about something called serotonin syndrome, which is more likely to occur if someone takes a larger dose. However, because the active molecule in psilocybin that produces these sort of effects connects to the 5-HT2A receptor in the brain, as does SSRIs. What you find is it's kind of like two people shooting basketballs at the same hoop, and they're kind of like knocking each other out. And so psychedelics, microdosing is much less effective in self-reported studies for people who are on SSRIs or SNRIs. So there are certainly things to be aware of, and it's important to have these conversations. I think it's very important to be open and honest with your doctor if you're considering these things and you are on other medications. And what's so interesting is I encourage everyone to have these conversations if they come to me and they are working with a psychiatrist. And so often psychiatrists are very enthusiastic about them doing this work. And I think we're going to see more and more as research continues to come out that psychiatrists themselves, that therapists themselves really want to work with psilocybin because they know it is a very powerful medicine. And there are a lot of preconceived notions that are really just based on like misinformation and propaganda.
Okay. So misinformation and propaganda from who?
I believe the government. When this first came to the United States, when I say this, I mean psilocybin, it was the 1950s. Oh gosh, I'm losing his name right now, but it was in Life magazine. There was this big article about he went down to Mexico in the region of Oaxaca, and he took a large dose with a curandera, an abuelita, like a medicine woman, Maria Sabina. And he was so blown away by what happened, what he experienced. And he sort of brought mushrooms to the United States, right? And then from there, in the 1950s and the 1960s, there was so much research going on about how beneficial psilocybin and LSD would be for the treatment of primarily addiction and alcoholism. And when the government started to see that, yes, this was a powerful tool, but maybe a tool in the wrong direction, or a tool that they wanted to use as like a truth serum, right? We hear about that experience with the CIA and LSD in San Francisco, where they unknowingly, to the people, they dosed people unknowingly to them and thought they might produce some sort of like truth serum in this experience. They began classifying psychedelics, LSD, and psilocybin in the same category as things like heroin and cocaine. And when you look at the DEA and, the like class 1 substances, things like heroin and cocaine, but also labeled in things like psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, the conditions for that category are like no medical use, and that have the ability to be toxic. And when they say toxic, they mean like the ability to kill you, right? So heroin is obviously very toxic. It doesn't take many doses or a super high dose. You still have a huge risk of dying. But when it comes to LSD and psilocybin, you would have to take 1,000 times the dose in order to kill you. And there are studied medical benefits of things like psilocybin and LSD. So it feels like a large miscategorization on the part of the government to try to stop people from using substances like this. And I will say, like, at a larger dose, I do think it's very important to be safe because, again, you are sort of out of your body. I wouldn't say that you're in control. I would never tell someone to go get in the car in the same way that if someone drank at dinner, I would not say, go operate that motor vehicle. However, I don't believe it's dangerous in the same way, especially not microdosing.
All right. So if these are categorized in the same sphere as heroin and cocaine, are they illegal?
Yeah. So right now there's a large initiative, and, maybe it's something that's more prevalent for me because I see news all the time and, your phone listens to you and I follow different accounts on the internet, but there's a big push for decriminalization and legalization of these substances. So Oregon and Colorado are really at the forefront. They are now legalized, and they're going to, they're opening centers where people can come and experience these things in safe environments with facilitators for intentional, beneficial medical uses. But it's kind of the same thing that we see with cannabis, where weed started to have different legalization in different states, but there was this tension between state and federal regulations. And I think we're going to see psilocybin go through the same process.
All right. Well, that'll be interesting. That's just, so let me go back now and ask this question. It sounds like in order to do this properly, it needs to be under supervision or guidance of some sort of professional. Does that sound right?
What I like to tell people is, you could probably safely microdose and have a positive experience. And what I like to say, you could have a good day, but are you really going to have an amazing life or create an amazing life from these types of experiences? No, it's unlikely, because you're missing a key component that is my largest focus in my work, which is integration, right? If you're not pairing microdosing with an intentional practice, if you're not using it with a really focused mind and pairing it with what research calls like intentional learning, then you're not necessarily maximizing the benefits of what's happening in your brain, and you're leaving a lot of money on the table. One time I was on a date with someone and they were trying to understand what I did, and basically they said, okay, so if you don't microdose sort of like intentionally or under supervision or with a guide, then it's kind of like taking steroids but not going to the gym. I was like, that's a kind of a weird example, but actually, yes, that's kind of exactly what's happening, because again, steroids don't make you have muscles, you have to still work to create the muscle. Of course, the muscle might come a little bit easier and it might be bigger than your normal muscular capacity. But in the same way, just microdosing on your own, taking a capsule or grinding up, a small amount pre-measured of mushrooms isn't going to probably give you the intended effects, and certainly not in a long-lasting way.
Interesting. All right. So let me do this bit of clarification for my listeners. Yes, I'm still a little confused on some things, as you can tell by my questions. And when I set this up with Julie, I knew that this was going to be something that was going to take a few different sit downs to discuss. And one of the things that I want to at least try to get to in this first episode, and then have you come back next week, is to ask how you actually got started, because you mentioned your story's a little different. And you have a history with some things, but not microdosing. And if people look you up on the internet, they're going to see that you were an attorney. And it looks like you left being an attorney to being a microdosing coach, but that's not the whole story, is it?
No, it's not. And I appreciate your feedback of this still feels confusing, because I do always feel like it's on me to clarify. Like, I want to make sure that I can communicate this in a way that anyone and everyone can understand. But no, I didn't just suddenly stop being an attorney and then got into psychedelics and here I am now. I followed a path that I thought was what I should do, essentially. I thought I wanted to be a doctor when I went into college. And then I realized, wow, blood was not something that was going to happen for me. I couldn't do it. And that left me with kind of an identity crisis. And I love my mom, and I truly believe everything my mom has ever done has been because she loves me and just wants me to be happy. But I felt a lot of pressure to she was paying for my college education. It's like, okay, you don't want to be a doctor? Okay. But what are you going to do? Figure it out right now. And in that moment of pressure, I just sat down and made a list of what am I good at? What do I like? What don't I like? What am I not skilled at? And lawyer came up. And so that's the path that I pursued. There was this underlying desire. I really wanted to help people. That's why I wanted to be a doctor. I wanted to help people. And I thought, okay, you can still help people being a lawyer. It's not impossible. Of course, lawyers do get a bad rap a lot of times. And I pursued that path. I pursued it so far that I practiced. I have multiple bar admissions, but I didn't like it. I wasn't happy. And there was a lot of underlying stuff that I had never dealt with that was really coming to a head, that was causing me to have very intense anxiety and depression, that was causing me to kind of spiral and feel super lost at the age of, 25, 26, 27. I'm not supposed to be having this identity crisis at that age, right? I'm not 50 yet. And so I sort of pressed eject on my life. And where I originally found my footing again was simply in the world of personal development and coaching. Personal development helped me so much more than I felt therapy was helping me. I felt like therapy was very re-traumatizing. I didn't know that that was really going to get to the root of healing for any of the stuff that I had been through. And I enjoyed coaching because it felt very future focused. It was yes, we have the past. We're acknowledging the past. The past is certainly what has created the lenses, the thoughts, the beliefs, the operating systems. And that doesn't mean we can't rewire it and move forward in a different way. So I really enjoyed coaching. And I was very much a more traditional, success executive coach when I first got certified in simply coaching. And I liked that. It was good. I was helping people. I was good at it. However, it felt like there was this glass ceiling that I sort of was hitting, but I couldn't break through. And when I found microdosing in the story I shared earlier, it just felt like everything shifted. And, now I feel I feel so in my purpose, and my business is much more successful than it's ever been, which to me is also an indicator of you're really doing something that people need. And clearly there's a part of me that feels so energized to really give it my all in a way that I had never felt before as a lawyer, as a more traditional coach.
All right. This is what really hooked me when we were talking, is the switching of realizing what wasn't working, what wasn't making you happy, and finding what does make you happy. And that's where I like to hear those stories of that, transition, those, aha moments in life. Now, it sounds like you kind of were experiencing, I don't want to say depression, but you were talking about this, not feeling fulfilled and, dealing with stuff. I mean, did you know what that stuff was at the time, or did you kind of figure it out later?
So it's interesting. I didn't grow up having conversations about mental health, and I had a very skewed view of what depression was. Like, I thought if I wasn't contemplating ending my life, that I wasn't depressed. And so looking back now, for instance, in college, I can see that I was experiencing panic attacks, and I was experiencing very low affective mood, and I was experiencing all these things that would have led to a diagnosis in depression, functional depression, but depression. But I didn't have I didn't have any like paradigms to work that out in my mind. I just had no exposure to sort of what that meant. But by the time, I had been a lawyer for 2 or 3 years, I began to realize, something really isn't good. And I will always say that I know the root of everything that's gone on in my life started with the fact that my dad died when I was 6. Like, that is a very traumatic thing that really changed the trajectory of my life and has impacted me in so many ways, like in my head and things that cause and bring up my anxiety and depression. So I had some idea, but it's so interesting now, like that I'm in coaching, like 5 years, in psychedelics, 3 to 4 years into this journey. I can really see now, like, why things are the way they are within me, which obviously helps me to understand why things are the way they are within others.
Okay. Well, like I said, I want to make sure we get into all of that and take the proper time to flesh that out. So I've asked you to come back and do another show next week. So we will continue on with that thought. But let me go back and just make sure in understanding microdosing 101, is there kind of like a question or perspective that I missed? Because remember, I knew nothing. And I'll just be honest and say, I just, when I first saw the term, I did, of course, a quick Google, and I'm like, oh, drugs. Okay. And just dismissed it. But again, hearing your story, okay, let me go back and think about it. But from my perspective and asking you these questions, what are some questions you think I didn't ask that I should have, or do you have a question for me?
Well, if you're open, what came to mind when you were speaking was actually me thinking about a woman who started working with me back in January, who was very much in your position of she really didn't even drink, but she'd certainly never done any sort of like drug. She never had any big psychedelic experience. And like, there was a big sticking point for her of she felt scared. She didn't really understand. And so I think it may be helpful for me to walk through kind of what I told her and like how that went for her.
Okay.
If that works for you.
Sure.
So, this is what I say to everyone when they first start. I totally understand that there's some apprehension because it's something that you've never experienced before. It's definitely easier to explain to anyone who's done like any type of substance, right? Even if you've smoked weed, it'd be easier for me to sit here and kind of explain what microdosing is like. But if you're not used to having your perceptions altered, it's hard to explain, well, it's a very subtle thing that really shouldn't be observed, but it's not like a big trip. I'm using language and concepts that you've never experienced for yourself. So of course there's more difficulty in that. But I just, would love to tell everyone that microdosing is a very safe process. So what I encourage new people to do is the first time they microdose, and when you microdose, you receive these capsules, not for me, but there are other companies. That's kind of how I protect myself and my business. I don't sell or distribute any sort of mushroom. I just guide people in the process. You receive a capsule and it looks like a vitamin capsules. It's a blend of the psilocybin mushroom, psilocybes, and functional mushrooms. So lion's mane, reishi, all these things that we hear about like as nootropics, things that are really good for our brains. And it contains a very small amount, 0.1 grams of psilocybin. When you think about like people who trip, right, they're taking 2 grams and above. So again, it's like 1/20th of even the smallest of like recreational full trip doses. You're going to receive this capsule and you're just going to take it like a vitamin capsule. You're going to take it in the process that I describe in my program. And you're simply going to give yourself the space, which is just being very intentional, right? There's no crazy thing that you do. It's taking it and then doing some things like setting it intentionally and journaling around some questions, perhaps going through one of the meditations or hypnoses I have in the program available to you to help make sure everything is really like sticking. All your neuroplasticity is really happening in your brain. And then I simply encourage someone to give themselves the space to feel, because the most intense thing that may happen is that you may feel emotional. You may feel like, oh, maybe I'm not normally a crier, but I'm feeling some things come up and I kind of want to cry. Or, maybe you just feel a little bit intensified in whatever emotional experience you're having. So I do recommend for the first few times not to plan anything. If you have kids, get a babysitter so that you can just let yourself go through whatever is kind of coming up, but you're not going to be impaired. If there was a fire in your house, it's not like you wouldn't be able to grab your dog, grab your kids and get out of the house. It simply can be an emotional experience. But for most people, what happened for her was she said, oh, I didn't really feel anything. It was nice. I was super happy. I had that time in the morning where I journaled. She has a relationship with God. So she prayed, she did her daily devotional. But she said, I didn't feel out of control. I didn't feel like I wasn't myself. And if anything, she said, I started to notice that at about, between 1 and 4 hours after taking the capsule, that life just felt a little bit brighter. And I think the best way to describe that is like you just sort of notice things that are always there, but which we kind of gloss over because adult human beings have very low entropy brains. We perform low heat searches, which we can talk about more in the next podcast. But we file out a lot of information and we don't take in a lot of information into our brains because it would be exhausting for us to take in that amount of information all the time. So a lot of stuff gets blocked out. But when we kind of open up and take more in, we see, oh, wow, like that tree has always been in my front yard, but that's actually a really beautiful tree. Or, we see a little kid smile because they got one of those little bubble machines and you notice, oh, like that childlike wonder. You're just noticing things that have always been there. It's not things that aren't there, aren't real, but you're seeing them in a way that kind of inspires more awe and wonder within you. And it allows you just to feel more positive and uplifted about the world and about your experience. But it truly is not seeing anything that it's not there. It's not feeling anything that isn't an authentic feeling, or even being unable to go about your life.
All right. Because I was just about to say, this isn't like seeing hallucinations as the movies would depict, right? No,
that's like a full dose.
Okay.
You could not hallucinate. I would think like if someone came to me and was like, I saw something, I'd be like, you didn't tell me about a medication or you took 1 million capsules. Like there's no way. There's not enough psilocin, which is the molecule that's producing the trip at a larger dose. There's not enough psilocin in 0.1 grams of a ground up psilocybe to produce that.
Okay. And with those scientific words, I think I'm gonna end the questions here and tell everybody to be looking forward to our next show that will be released sometime in the next week. But in the meantime, Julie Hagen joined me today, and if you are looking on the show notes, her information will be there. She has a website and a very active Instagram where you can go and look things up. And it's not going to say Julie Hagen. It's going to say Julie Sivan.
That's my middle name. And, from a marketing perspective, it's just much catchier.
It is. It's got a little hipster sound to it there. So, yeah. All right, Julie, thank you very much. I thank you most of all for allowing me to ask the questions to understand what it is. And now I get to go back and assimilate what you've told me and hopefully have some better questions for next time as we dig more into your journey and how you see microdosing going for the rest of the world.
Thank you so much for having me and for being willing to have these conversations that, maybe aren't in your typical vein. I really appreciate it.
All right. Well, listen, everything that I can do on this show to help people live better, live healthy, and be happy, that's what we're going to do. And like I said, even if it's something I'm not accustomed to, there are people out there that are accustomed to it or might need to be exposed to it. So that's what we're going to do. So, Julie, thanks a lot. And we'll see you next time. And for those of you listening, enjoy yourselves. And like I said just a moment ago, live healthy, be happy, and we'll see you next time. Holla.